The first reports did not sound like the beginning of a war. They sounded like routine alerts, the kind that military analysts hear almost every week in the volatile Middle East. A radar track here, a missile launch warning there, a brief spike in air defense activity over the eastern Mediterranean. But within minutes, intelligence officers in Washington realized something far more serious was unfolding. The nightmare scenario American strategists had spent decades trying to prevent was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. Israel and Iran were no longer fighting in the shadows. The confrontation had erupted into open, uncontrollable escalation. For years, the conflict between Israel and Iran had been fought in the margins of global attention. Cyber attacks, assassinations, covert operations, explosions at mysterious facilities, drone strikes on shadowy targets in Syria and Iraq. Each incident was dramatic but contained. Each one was carefully calibrated so that neither side crossed the invisible line into full-scale war. That delicate balance was fragile, but it held. Until it didn't. The first major strike reportedly occurred deep inside Iranian territory. Satellite images that emerged hours later would show smoke rising from what analysts believe was a critical military installation connected to Iran's missile infrastructure. Israeli officials did not immediately claim responsibility. They rarely do in such situations, but the message was unmistakable. The operation had the precision, the timing, and the strategic symbolism of a calculated Israeli move. Iran's leadership did not take long to respond. Within hours, sirens began to sound across parts of Israel. Air defense systems lit up the night sky. Interceptors launched rapidly from batteries positioned around major population centers. On radar screens, dozens of incoming projectiles were detected approaching Israeli airspace from multiple directions. Some were believed to be long-range drones. Others appeared to be ballistic missiles. For ordinary civilians, the experience was surreal. Residents in Tel Aviv described stepping out onto balconies and seeing streaks of light tearing across the darkness, some climbing upward to intercept threats, others descending toward distant impacts. The familiar rumble of the Iron Dome defense system echoed through neighborhoods already tense from years of regional instability. For the Israeli military, however, this was unlike previous flare-ups with militant groups. This time the threat was coming directly from a powerful regional state. Iranian officials framed the retaliation as a necessary response to what they called an act of aggression against their sovereignty. State television showed images of military commanders vowing that any attack on Iranian soil would be met with consequences that Israel would not be able to contain. Behind the scenes, emergency meetings were unfolding in capitals around the world. In Washington, senior officials gathered in secure rooms where large digital maps tracked the unfolding situation minute by minute. American military commanders were suddenly faced with a terrifying possibility. If the confrontation spiraled further, U.S. forces stationed across the Middle East could become targets. American bases in Iraq, Syria, and the Persian Gulf were placed on heightened alert. Naval assets moved quietly into defensive positions. Fighter jets were prepared for rapid deployment. The United States had long promised unwavering support for Israel's security, but policymakers also understood that a direct war between Israel and Iran could ignite the entire region. Militias aligned with Iran operate across several countries, and many of them possess rockets, drones, and fighters capable of opening new fronts almost instantly. That meant the conflict might not remain confined to two nations. Within hours of the initial exchange, reports began to surface of heightened activity among armed groups in Lebanon and Syria. Israeli intelligence warned that additional attacks could come from multiple directions simultaneously, a scenario often referred to by military planners as a multi-front war. For Israeli citizens, the uncertainty was almost as frightening as the explosions themselves. Supermarkets saw sudden crowds as families stocked up on supplies. Schools in several regions temporarily suspended classes. Emergency shelters were inspected and prepared. The Israeli government urged calm, but also instructed the public to remain near protected areas. Across Iran, the atmosphere was equally tense, but shaped by a different narrative. Government officials portrayed the confrontation as a moment of national defiance. Crowds gathered in some cities chanting slogans against Israel, while military leaders promised that the country's strategic capabilities would deter any further aggression. But beneath the rhetoric, analysts suspected that both governments were weighing extremely dangerous decisions. Israel has long viewed Iran's expanding missile arsenal and nuclear ambitions as existential threats. Iranian leaders, meanwhile, see Israel as a hostile force backed by powerful Western allies. That mutual suspicion has created a cycle of escalation that has intensified over the past decade. What made this moment different was the scale. This was no longer a hidden war fought through proxies and covert operations. The strikes were direct, the retaliation was immediate, and the entire world could see it unfolding. Airspace across parts of the Middle East began to close as airlines rerouted flights to avoid potential danger zones. Energy markets reacted instantly, with oil prices surging amid fears that a wider regional conflict could disrupt critical shipping routes. In Europe and Asia, governments issued urgent diplomatic calls urging restraint, but the speed of the events made it clear that diplomacy was struggling to keep up. Every new radar detection, every new explosion, every new military movement carried the risk of triggering the next stage of escalation. For decades, American strategists had warned that a direct war between Israel and Iran would be one of the most destabilizing conflicts imaginable, a crisis capable of drawing in multiple countries, disrupting global trade, and pushing already fragile regional tensions to the breaking point. Now, as missiles crossed the skies and defense systems roared into action, that once theoretical scenario had suddenly become reality. And the most frightening question of all was no longer whether the conflict could start, it was whether anyone still had the power to stop it. In the hours that followed the first wave of strikes, the tempo of events accelerated so quickly that even seasoned intelligence analysts struggled to keep pace. What had begun as a dangerous exchange of blows was now evolving into something far larger, a chain reaction of military decisions, each one raising the stakes for the entire region. Military command centers across the Middle East were now operating under maximum alert, their screens filled with constantly shifting data. Radar tracks, satellite feeds, drone reconnaissance images, and encrypted communications poured into situation rooms where officers knew that a single miscalculation could ignite a regional war. Israel's defense leadership understood that the initial Iranian retaliation might only be the beginning. Iran possesses one of the largest missile arsenals in the region, including hundreds of medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching almost every corner of Israeli territory. Even more concerning to Israeli planners was the possibility that Iran might activate its network of allied militias across the Middle East. For years, those groups had been quietly building up stockpiles of rockets and drones, many supplied or designed with Iranian support. If they entered the conflict simultaneously, Israel could face attacks from multiple borders at once, and then the reports began to come in. From northern Israel, military observers detected unusual activity across the Lebanese border. Surveillance drones captured images of vehicles moving toward launch positions in areas long associated with armed groups aligned with Iran. Israeli air defense units in the north were immediately reinforced, while fighter jets began conducting patrols at low altitude along the frontier. At the same time, U.S. intelligence agencies were tracking signals from several Iranian-aligned militias in Iraq and Syria. Communications traffic suggested those groups were preparing for possible operations against American bases in the region. For Washington, this was the scenario policymakers had feared for years, the moment when a confrontation between Israel and Iran might pull American forces directly into the line of fire. Inside the Pentagon, the situation was being monitored minute by minute. Senior commanders reviewed contingency plans that had been prepared long before this crisis. U.S. naval forces in the Persian Gulf were instructed to increase defensive readiness. Aircraft carriers positioned in nearby waters adjusted their flight operations. Patriot and other missile defense systems protecting American installations were brought to their highest alert levels. Publicly, American officials called for restraint from all sides. Privately, they were preparing for the possibility that restraint might already be impossible. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the psychological impact of the confrontation was spreading. Air raid sirens continued to sound intermittently across different regions as new threats were detected. Each alarm sent families rushing into shelters, some built into apartment complexes, others reinforced rooms inside homes. Children clutched their parents as the distant thunder of interceptors echoed through the sky. Emergency services moved rapidly through cities, responding to debris from intercepted drones and missiles. While Israel's layered defense systems were intercepting many incoming threats, no defense is perfect. Several projectiles managed to slip through the shield, striking open areas and causing damage that reminded citizens how fragile security can be during moments like this. Television broadcasts across Israel showed military analysts explaining the scale of the challenge the country now faced. Unlike past conflicts against non-state groups, this confrontation involved a powerful nation with advanced capabilities and a long reach. In Iran, the government was projecting confidence. State media aired dramatic footage of missile launches, accompanied by patriotic music and declarations that the country's armed forces were demonstrating their strength. Iranian officials argued that their response was justified and warned that any additional attacks on Iranian territory would be met with far more devastating retaliation. But behind the scenes, Iranian decision-makers were also navigating immense pressure. Iran's leadership understands that a full-scale war with Israel could quickly expand beyond control, especially if the United States became directly involved. Iran's economy has already faced years of sanctions and internal strain. A major war could place enormous stress on the country's infrastructure and political stability. Yet backing down after a direct strike on Iranian soil could be seen domestically as weakness, something the leadership could not easily accept. That tension between deterrence and escalation was now driving the crisis forward. Across the region, governments were watching anxiously. In the Gulf states, leaders worried that any prolonged conflict could threaten oil facilities and shipping lanes that carry a significant portion of the world's energy supply. In Europe, officials feared that a major Middle Eastern war could trigger economic shocks and new waves of instability. But perhaps the most nervous observers were in Washington. American intelligence agencies had spent years studying exactly how a direct Israel-Iran war might unfold. Their models suggested that once the first large-scale strikes occurred, events could escalate in unpredictable ways. Retaliation would trigger counter-retaliation. Proxy groups might enter the fight. Civilian casualties could harden public opinion on all sides, and the window for diplomacy could close faster than anyone expected. Late that night, new alarms began appearing on military radar systems. This time the trajectories were different. Instead of drones or short-range rockets, analysts detected what appeared to be longer-range ballistic missiles launching from deeper within Iranian territory. These weapons travel at tremendous speeds and are far more difficult to intercept. Within seconds, Israeli defense networks calculated possible impact zones. Air defense batteries shifted positions automatically. Interceptor missiles were launched into the sky in rapid succession. Across Israel, sirens began wailing again, louder, longer, more urgent than before. For many civilians, the sound sent a chill through their bodies. This was no longer a limited exchange. This was beginning to look like the opening phase of a sustained campaign, and as the missiles arced across the night sky toward their targets, military commanders on both sides knew something that civilians could only sense in fragments. Once ballistic missiles start flying between two powerful adversaries, stopping the cycle of escalation becomes far more difficult, because every strike creates pressure for an even stronger response. And by the early hours of that tense morning, the world was beginning to realize that the confrontation between Israel and Iran had crossed into territory that few leaders had ever truly believed they would have to face. The war that strategists once described as a nightmare scenario was no longer hypothetical. It was unfolding one launch at a time. By the time the third wave of attacks began, the crisis had already crossed a psychological threshold that many military experts once believed both sides would avoid at all costs. What had started as retaliation was now evolving into a grinding cycle of escalation. Each strike was no longer just a message. It was becoming part of a sustained campaign whose consequences were spreading far beyond the original battlefield. In Israel, the early morning hours brought a strange mixture of exhaustion and fear. Many families had barely slept. Sirens had sounded multiple times throughout the night, forcing people to move repeatedly between their beds and reinforced shelters. The tension in the air was heavy, not just because of the attacks themselves, but because no one knew how much worse things might become. In military command centers, Israeli officers studied fresh satellite images and intelligence reports. Some Iranian launch sites appeared to be preparing for additional missile strikes. Mobile units had moved to new positions, making them harder to track. Israeli planners faced a difficult calculation. If they waited passively, Iran might continue launching waves of missiles. But if Israel escalated its own strikes inside Iran, the confrontation could spiral into a full-scale regional war. Still, the pressure to act was enormous. Hours earlier, fragments of intercepted missiles had fallen across several Israeli communities. Emergency responders reported damaged buildings, fires sparked by debris, and injured civilians. While the country's defense systems had prevented far worse destruction, the message was clear. Iran had the ability to strike deep inside Israeli territory, and Israel had no intention of appearing vulnerable. Shortly after dawn, reports began circulating among international intelligence agencies that Israeli aircraft had carried out another operation far beyond their borders. Analysts tracking flight paths and radar activity detected signs of long-range air missions combined with what appeared to be precision-guided strikes. Soon afterward, explosions were reported in multiple locations connected to Iran's military infrastructure. Some were believed to involve facilities linked to missile production and storage. Others appeared to target logistical networks used by Iran's regional forces. Iranian officials reacted swiftly. State media described the attacks as a blatant act of war and warned that the consequences would extend beyond anything seen so far in the confrontation. Military commanders appeared on television promising a response that would demonstrate the true reach of Iran's strategic capabilities. Those words were not just rhetoric. Across the region, intelligence agencies began picking up signals that several Iranian-aligned groups were preparing to move. In southern Lebanon, armed fighters were reportedly repositioning rocket launchers closer to the Israeli border. In Iraq and Syria, militia units that had previously targeted American bases during past tensions were again activating communication networks. For Washington, this development was deeply alarming. American officials had been working urgently through diplomatic channels to prevent exactly this outcome, a widening of the conflict beyond the original two adversaries. But as events continued to unfold, it was becoming clear that control over the situation was slipping away. The United States now faced an extremely delicate position. On one hand, it had pledged strong support for Israel's security. On the other, American leaders were determined to avoid a direct war with Iran that could pull U.S. forces into a massive regional conflict. Yet the reality on the ground was beginning to challenge that balance. Several American military bases in the Middle East were already operating under heightened threat levels. Commanders had ordered troops to remain inside fortified areas whenever possible. Missile defense systems surrounding the bases were scanning constantly for incoming threats. And then, shortly after midday, the warning alarms sounded. At least 2 American installations in the region detected incoming projectiles believed to have been launched by militia groups aligned with Iran. Air defense systems responded immediately, intercepting some of the threats before they could reach their targets. Initial reports suggested limited damage, but the message behind the attack was unmistakable. The conflict was spreading. Back in Israel, military planners were now preparing for the possibility of a northern front opening along the Lebanese border. For years, Israeli strategists have considered that scenario one of the most dangerous challenges the country could face. Armed groups in Lebanon possess tens of thousands of rockets. many capable of reaching major Israeli cities. If those weapons were launched in large numbers while Iranian missiles continued arriving from the east, Israel's defenses could be severely strained. The Israeli government began mobilizing additional reserve forces, reinforcing units near the northern frontier. Convoys of military vehicles moved along highways as soldiers prepared for a confrontation that could rapidly escalate into ground combat. For civilians living near the border, the tension was immediate and personal. Many families had already experienced previous conflicts in the region. Now they watched military vehicles roll past their homes once again, wondering whether this crisis would finally erupt into something far larger. In Iran, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly charged. Public demonstrations showed crowds waving flags and chanting slogans against Israel. Government officials emphasized national unity and resilience in the face of foreign attacks, but behind the scenes, Iran's leadership was carefully calculating its next move. Launching too weak a response might undermine their credibility. Launching too strong a response could provoke an even larger Israeli and possibly American reaction. This delicate balance had defined the shadow conflict between the two countries for years. But now, with missiles already exchanged and new fronts threatening to open, the margin for caution was shrinking. Meanwhile, global markets reacted nervously as news of the expanding confrontation spread. Oil prices surged amid fears that a prolonged conflict could threaten vital shipping routes through the Persian Gulf and nearby waterways. Airlines diverted flights away from the most dangerous airspace corridors. Governments issued travel warnings as the region edged closer to a broader crisis. Diplomatic efforts intensified across world capitals. Leaders from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East placed urgent calls urging both sides to de-escalate. Some proposed emergency negotiations aimed at halting the spiral of retaliation, but diplomacy moved slowly. Missiles moved fast, and as night began to fall again across the Middle East, new radar signals were already appearing on defense systems, signals suggesting that the next phase of the confrontation might be even more dangerous than the last. For millions of people watching the crisis unfold, one question now hung heavily in the air. Had the conflict already passed the point where anyone could bring it back under control? Or was the world about to witness the moment when a regional confrontation finally exploded into something far bigger than anyone had planned? As darkness settled over the region for the second night of the crisis, the atmosphere across the Middle East felt heavier than it had in decades. The rhythm of daily life had been replaced by the rhythm of alarms, radar detections, and urgent military briefings. In cities thousands of miles apart, decision-makers sat in dimly lit command rooms, staring at screens that showed the same thing, a conflict that was no longer theoretical, no longer contained, and perhaps no longer controllable. The fourth phase of the confrontation did not begin with a single explosion. It began with silence. For several tense hours after sunset, radar screens across Israel showed no new launches. Air defense crews remained in their positions, watching the sky, waiting for the next signal that might appear without warning. In homes across the country, families sat quietly near shelters, afraid to relax, but desperate for a moment of calm. Military analysts studying Iranian launch sites noticed something unusual. Many of the mobile missile units that had fired earlier in the day were now relocating again, dispersing into different regions. Satellite images showed convoys moving along remote highways under the cover of darkness. To some experts, that movement suggested Iran was preparing for another coordinated strike. To others, it hinted at something different, a strategic pause. Inside Israel's war cabinet, leaders debated their options with growing intensity. Some commanders argued that Israel should launch a massive preemptive campaign against Iran's missile infrastructure before more attacks could be organized. Others warned that such an operation might trigger an even larger regional war, drawing in additional actors and potentially pulling global powers into the confrontation. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Washington was facing its own dilemma. American intelligence agencies had spent decades modeling exactly this kind of escalation. Those models predicted a dangerous chain reaction. Israeli strikes prompting Iranian retaliation activating regional militias, and militia attacks eventually drawing American forces into direct conflict. By now, pieces of that model were already becoming reality. The earlier attacks on American installations had not caused catastrophic damage, but they had crossed a line. U.S. military commanders now had to consider whether additional defensive measures might be required if the attacks continued. In quiet conversations behind closed doors, American officials began exploring one last avenue that might still slow the momentum toward a wider war: urgent back-channel diplomacy. Messages were sent through intermediaries, governments that maintained communication with both sides. The purpose was simple but extremely difficult: convince Israel and Iran that continuing the cycle of strikes would only make the situation uncontrollable. But diplomacy was now racing against time. Just after midnight, Israeli radar systems detected another set of launch signatures emerging from Iranian territory. The warning flashed instantly across command networks: ballistic missiles. Within seconds, sirens began echoing across Israeli cities again. Interceptor batteries fired into the night sky, leaving glowing arcs of light that climbed rapidly toward the incoming threats. For civilians, the sound of those interceptors had become terrifyingly familiar. Families rushed into shelters once more, listening to the distant rumble of explosions as intercepts occurred high above them. This wave was different. Some missiles were intercepted, others broke apart mid-air, but several managed to slip through the defense network and strike areas near critical infrastructure. Emergency services reported fires and structural damage, though the full extent of the impact would not be known until daylight. Inside Israeli military headquarters, commanders realized something troubling. Iran still had significant missile capacity remaining. The attacks could continue for days, possibly longer. But Iran's leadership was also watching the battlefield closely. The strikes they had launched had demonstrated reach and capability, yet they had also triggered powerful international pressure and brought the region dangerously close to a broader conflict. Iranian officials now faced the same terrifying question confronting their adversaries: how far could this escalation go before it became impossible to stop? And that was when something unexpected began to happen. Shortly after the latest wave of strikes, diplomatic signals started moving rapidly between capitals. Governments that rarely agreed on anything suddenly shared the same urgent priority: prevent the conflict from expanding any further. Private messages reached both Tehran and Jerusalem. The warnings were blunt. If the confrontation continued to escalate, multiple fronts could ignite simultaneously. Militias might unleash massive rocket barrages. Shipping routes could become targets. Oil infrastructure could be threatened. The economic shock alone could destabilize countries far beyond the Middle East. The nightmare scenario was no longer just about missiles. It was about the entire global system being shaken by a war that none of the major powers truly wanted. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tempo of the battlefield began to change. Radar screens showed fewer launches. Military communications that had been frantic hours earlier began to quiet. Surveillance satellites detected missile units remaining in place rather than preparing for immediate firing. It was not a ceasefire, it was something more fragile, a moment of hesitation. In Israel, exhausted civilians cautiously stepped out of shelters after hours without sirens. Emergency crews continued their work under floodlights, clearing debris and assisting those injured in the strikes. In Iran, officials spoke about strength and resilience, but the tone of their statements subtly shifted toward emphasizing deterrence rather than further escalation. The world watched closely, uncertain whether this pause was the beginning of de-escalation or merely the calm before an even larger storm. Military analysts knew that the underlying tensions had not disappeared. The rivalry between Israel and Iran remained deep, shaped by years of distrust, strategic competition, and opposing visions for the future of the region. But for the moment, something powerful had happened. Both sides had glimpsed the edge of a war that could burn far beyond their control, And sometimes standing at the edge of that kind of fire forces even the fiercest rivals to step back, not because the conflict is resolved, but because they understand what the next step might unleash.